organisation that our primary mission is to bridge the gap between environmental sustainability, sustainability in the round, but with specific expertise and focus on environmental sustainability with the arts and culture. And we work with hundreds of organisations across the country, also increasingly internationally. And the short story is that in the period of time that we've been working, which is around 7 years, there has been a gentle and really interesting and exciting explosion of interest from the operational and the management right through to the artistic, where I think the arts and culture are increasingly being plunged into this extraordinary area that is around our relationship to ourselves, to our communities and our societies at large, and what that means for this very beautiful world that we all jointly share. So today is part of a series of events and conversations and blogs and thought pieces which we've called Sustaining Creativity. And if you want to tweet, you do use that hashtag Sustaining Creativity. We're really pleased to be in this particular building. It will become very evident why that is the case, but I do want to say thank you to Deborah right up front and to this super group of panellists I'm going to introduce in a minute. It's a very apt place to launch the first of our public conversations on value and cultural spaces. The reason that we're doing Sustaining Creativity, and it's a programme that's just ongoing, we started it last November and it's just going to last for as long as it needs to, or we want it to, is that we feel that the arts and culture embody the collective psyche, whether that be a local psyche or a bigger global psyche. There's something about the arts and culture that really embodies that complex psyche that makes us human beings. They reflect and they define cultural values. And I think now, more so than perhaps any other time in our short human history, they really need to get cracking on understanding, shaping what we mean when we talk about cultural values. We're at a time where what I think we all would understand the term late capitalism, where late capitalism, as referenced by endless consumptive growth, really is the abiding single ideology. I'm not sure when it became the ultimate truth, but it has done. And it seems to be that it is the current version of capitalism, of advanced capitalism, that is the only way that we can all go. It seems to be that growth is the way that we have healthy societies and healthy economies. And really, I think the arts and culture can indeed, as they always have done, can question and reflect on that single prevailing ideology. And I think it's important that it does, because that ideology has brought us side effects including climate change and resource degradation and acidification of oceans and all the other effects that over massive global consumption will bring. And it's something that we really do need to think about hard. Current versions of capitalism, in my view, are just not an adequate response, not just because of climate change, but also because they don't tell us anything. It doesn't tell us enough about ourselves in the non-material sphere. It doesn't tell us enough about our societies, how we work, what are the much deeper forces at play. And the arts and culture really can do something very interesting in this space. We can transform and we can transcend ways of being. We can knock about with norms. So it's a really urgent, I think, and a really compelling arena in which that we now inhabit, and that this building in many ways embodies around contemporary living. But I think we need to also question what we're talking about when we talk about cultural values. It's a very live conversation that's happening at the moment. Many big voices in the cultural sector are mustering all sorts of evidences to describe and to justify ourselves as art sectors. And that's fantastic, and it's become much more mature and much more interesting and much more well articulated, and I think John will talk a little bit about that. but it's being largely defined in a three-dimensional way. We're talking about values that affect culture. We're talking about values that root ourselves financially and economically, and we're talking about values that define and explore the communities and the places that we inhabit as the arts and culture. And there's one absolutely critical missing ingredient that is very often invoked when we talk about sustainability, and that is the environment. And that, for me, has been noticeably absent in many of the very interesting and important conversations around the arts, culture and value that we're having as a community at the moment. And if I have a personal ambition, it is to state and restate and affirm and reaffirm that environmental values are absolutely critical to everything that we do, every way that we think, every context, every artistic expression that we actually engage with. It is the world in which we live, both on the micro, the place, this beautiful theatre, in relation to this fantastic city, in relation to this country, in relation to the world. It's all deeply connected, and it's a conversation that in my view we are not having enough of. So I want to make sure that through the work that we're doing on sustaining creativity, we start to slightly recalibrate this conversation that we're having, so that we start to bring in a richer context of cultural value that includes this very important parameter. It is the defining parameter, and move it from being what is in many minds considered as a restraint to being that point of constraint from which we can draw huge amounts of energy, inspiration, creativity, and visioning of a future that really does put overall well-being at its heart. And that is really why we're here today. It's very much about this place, and it's about these people. So without any further ado, what I'd like to do is introduce the panellists. There will be short presentations from each of them. There'll be, I hope, ample opportunity to hear from you guys and to take questions, and there will also be space at the end where lots of my team, our team, will be around to hear your stories. So I'm just going to whiz through this, and then we can get on to the debate. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Peter North. So Peter is a professor here at Liverpool University. He's a reader in alternative economies. So Peter is at the cutting edge of redefining a lot of what we take to be civic culture, civic space communities, working with transitional Liverpool, but looking at politics as being a force for change, looking at the relationship between the micro, small communities, how small communities can be huge drivers of change. Peter is a real expert on looking at what the future needs to hold for us as we make a very, very necessary transition into a different way of living. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much. Do you want me here or at the lectern? Am I okay here? It seems a bit funny looking at people's backs because we've had an arts person here who has subverted everything immediately by moving all the chairs, which is what I like to hear. I'm very pleased to be in this lovely building. It's the first time I have been here, so I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit more about it. I'm not somebody who's a cultural expert. My interest is more in rethinking economies, and I was very interested in what Alison was just saying then about late capitalism and about the extent, as people like Naomi Klein would say, the problem we've got is capitalism, and that we need a completely different way of thinking about the economy. Or the way some other people think about the economy. A Japanese businessman once said to me, well, do we actually need these big climate change agreements? Where was the agreement about the mobile phone? Where was the international agreement that said we'll all move on to the mobile phone or adopt the iPad? Is that change comes about more in grassroots way from innovation, and actually market economies can be really creative at that. So is there a little bit of hope? I don't know. I think there's reasons why capitalism can be ecocidal, and ways like climate change might actually save us. Capitalism might actually save us. But I wanted to say a little bit about the way that Liverpool is thinking about dealing with climate change, and I think that's important. If you go down to the docks, you'll be able to go into the Slavery Museum. And we know that we're in a city which is very beautiful. It's glorious Georgian buildings all around here. And we know that in many ways all those buildings are dripped in blood because they were created through what everybody thought was a sensible thing to do. Everybody, every normal person thought it's quite okay to steal people from one continent to another part of the continent, make them work for no pay for the rest of their lives. A third of them die on the trip over, get thrown to the sharks that follow the ships while that happens. And I tell my students about an episode of Star Trek where Captain Picard is talking to an alien race, and this alien race has got a box of reptiles on the table in front of them. And this alien race periodically just picks up one of these little creatures swimming in the tank, bites its head off, blood goes everywhere. And of course the humans all vomit. They're horrified by this. And Picard says, well, I'm sorry about this. You need to understand that human race hasn't eaten meat for 200 years. And I use that to think about what are the things that we're doing at the moment that every right-thinking, normal, liberal, intelligent person does, that human races will go, what were you thinking? Future races, future humans will say, what were you thinking? And perhaps not dealing with climate change is one of those issues. And what I particularly like about the cultural sector is that, as Alison said, it's great for asking those kind of questions. I work with community groups like Transition Liverpool and with climate activists, but I also work with the Chamber of Commerce and with Liverpool Vision. So the people that would say, look, Pete, look at this city in 1980. Look what it was like. It was dirty. It was smelly. Nobody was coming here. It was a city that could have ended up like Detroit is now. Perhaps it's a city that had a big role in the 19th century, but doesn't have a role now. And the great thing about culture is that that didn't happen. And we saw through the Capital of Culture a few years ago, everybody celebrating what a wonderful, vibrant place Liverpool is. And it sort of signed off Liverpool's renaissance that has gone on since then. 2008, Lehman Brothers crashes, the international bankers crashed the global economy. The rest of us are still expected to pay for that through austerity. So you notice I'm not Miliband. I do remember to talk about austerity and the debt. We've seen that Liverpool is not the first into the recession. It's not the deepest in the UK, and we're not the last out of it. And culture has got a lot to do with that, and that's absolutely fantastic. So what's that got to do with climate change? I think one of the problems with looking at climate change is that it can just freeze you with pessimism. I think as a species, we're pretty good. If there's a lion in front of you going to eat you, we do something about it. Immediately we run away. If somebody says the way you're going on in 5 years' time, you're going to deplete that ecosystem and you're going to have a famine, we don't do anything about that. We seem to think something will turn up, something will turn up, something will turn up. And often it does, because market economies are very, very creative. And I've got a book on my shelves called World Famine 1975. Well, that didn't happen. 1880s, we were all going to starve because we were running out of bird poo, which was the only fertilizer that human beings had. And then, of course, through innovation, we developed other things. But telling people that we're depleting the ecosystem, which we are, that we've destroyed half of the species with which we share this planet, and we are, that the ice caps are melting, which they are, people tend to switch off if you keep saying it. So Martin Luther King never said racism in America is really bad. We've just hit the peak of black people being murdered on the streets of America. He said, I have a dream of a better world where you're judged by the content of your character, not the colour of your skin. And what I think is important about culture is that it can be fun. It can give you visions of a better way of living. It can ask questions of the powerful in a way that I find quite difficult when I'm talking to the Chamber of Commerce or I'm talking to Liverpool Vision, who want to talk hard economic numbers. But what's good about it is you can create a vibrant city through arts and through culture. That means people can have fun, enjoyable, but low carbon lives. It tells you that it isn't necessarily about earning more, consuming more, buying more cheap commodities imported through the docks into Liverpool as the way forward. We know that happiness studies tend to show that we get to a certain amount of income, and then really a little bit more doesn't make us any more happy. We tend to get stuck at a certain level. So what we need to do is find ways of having fun which are absolutely low carbon. It means we can have really enjoyable, vibrant, prosperous, but also low carbon lives. So it's not talking about hair shirts. It's not talking about what you can't do. It's not saying you can't get on that jet to go to Carcassonne for the weekend. It's you don't want to go to Carcassonne for that weekend because one, it's vulgar, but two, you can come to the Everyman and have a much better time. So it's lovely to see that we are creating that kind of vibrant life. That would say to things like Sefton Park, open spaces. They're not a legacy from the 19th century where everybody, you know, there were twice as many people in the city as there are now. And these parks are a burden that Liverpool Council needs to deal with. It therefore needs to build executive homes on it. It says these are a vibrant resource for the city. They're the lungs of the city. But they're also full of people doing fun things. There's the Food and Drink Festival. There's the International Music Festival. All the time you'll see buskers in that place. You go around Sefton Park and you'll see people doing outside body gyms. So seeing these places as really vibrant spaces for people to do all sorts of activity that provides them with a livelihood, and it makes these places really open and really animated. Really like the idea of moving on to parks which are not just green spaces, but there's food there, so we can put Tesco's out of business because you wouldn't buy an apple. Why would you buy an apple when you can just grow one off a tree that you're growing in your own streets? So I think it's really important to see culture as a way of generating low carbon forms of fun. Now, some people say to me that this green stuff, it's all very well, but remember this is a city that's still quite poor compared with other cities. You look at our emissions for this city, and it's true, they're not as high as some places. You know, we don't live the same life as an average Australian or Canadian or American person. So our emissions are actually okay. If we don't do anything, we are going to hit the UK climate change targets in Liverpool by 2020 because of all the deindustrialisation that's gone over the past 20 years. So you know, everybody that lost their job in the 1980s can feel a little bit better that they did a bit for the planet by that. You know, it's good that, you know, that kind of thing is happening. But what I think people don't quite get is that it's not a case of, you know, doing something for the environment is against growth. It's against a vibrant livelihood. The two things go together. If you don't build sustainability into all your economic activity now, in 20 years' time, frankly, you're not going to be able to be in business because other people are going to be doing something else. We've got to do it because the UK Climate Change Act tells us we've got to do it. But finally, I want to go back to slavery. We've got to do it because we're UNESCO World Heritage Sites. We put that all over our websites. Come to Liverpool and see this place up there with the Taj Mahal, one of the best places you can see. It's World Heritage Site because this is where international global trading started. So that system that, you know, nobody in the 19th century knew they were doing a bad thing when they set up that trading system, and it has built a lot of wealth around the world, but it created that global capitalism that we now know has caused the problem. So it's a bit difficult for us in Liverpool to say, well, our emissions are quite low globally, we don't need to do anything. China, oi, you stop building all those things that actually we buy, we create the demand for that stuff to come over, comes into Liverpool Port all the time. We've got to say that actually our responsibility for historical emissions is way up there at the top. We are one of the worst offenders over the past 200 years. And we've got to realise that just as we have done with slavery, that we need to do something about it and atone for that, but also build it into our system. But also recognise that many of the wonderful things that folk here are doing about culture are really, really good, really, really low carbon. It's creating that vibrant city that we all want to see. Means you don't want to go somewhere else. Creating lots of jobs, creating lots of businesses. So for me, that's a win-win situation. And the final thing I want to say, if I've got a minute, is I think there's a difference between in the stuff I've read about vernacular culture and created culture. And one of the things I think about creating a vibrant, low-carbon economy is at times backing off and creating spaces where people can do their thing. You know, the Beatles were so good. Why? Because of all those 10,000 hours they put in out their heads on speed in Hamburg in very dodgy places, because they were left alone to create that kind of culture. And I think there's something about all the time we try to create a culture and market a culture. And it's all part of growth. It's all part of doing more. It's all a part of building up something. And perhaps if we move to a way of thinking about our city that's built on happiness and built on creativity and built on prosperousness rather than the throughput of stuff and material and limited resources, and the emission of greenhouse gases associated with that, we might get a little bit more of a balance where, you know, it's a normal part of our life to be creative as part of what we're doing. So I love the way that places like, I understand this is the youth and community place. I love the way that we are creating spaces like in the Baltic and like here, where people can be creative, but it's the role of public policy is to do nothing except give people spaces to do things. I think one of the worst things that was ever done is when young people can't get unemployment benefit anymore and come out of universities with 9 grand fees. What is the best disincentive to being creative and setting up a business if you've got that hanging over you? Rather than, you know, in the 1970s and 1980s when I graduated, people would have the opportunity to, you know, frankly, create a little space of their own and create great culture out of it. So perhaps part of what we're doing is thinking through this difference between vernacular culture and creative culture, but see what the creative classes are doing in this city. It's not an optional extra, a nice to do, while the big guys get on with creating growth. It's actually part of what is essential to what makes this city this city. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Great rallying cry. Now we're going to have Deborah Aydon, who is the Executive Director here, and she's joined by Robert Longthorne, who are going to talk about this space.
Am I okay to stay sitting down? Yeah. Welcome, everybody, first of all. There's some very familiar faces who know the building well, and many of you who will just be coming in for the first time. So just to introduce this version of the Everyman, we're talking about sustainability today, and the old building simply wasn't sustainable. It was about survival, never mind sustainability. It was coming to the end. And so the new building is a way of giving it a new lease of life, but it's also a way of enabling it to be much more itself. The old building was constraining the spirit and the potential and the possibility of the Everyman and of all of the artists that create work here, and all of the audiences that can come and have experiences and have a community gathering point here. So over 10 years ago we embarked on the journey, but cutting to the chase, in March this year we opened the door on this beautiful building, which has proved to be popular, inspiring, and really vibrant already, is taken to the hearts of the people of Liverpool, and there's huge amounts of creative buzz happening throughout the building. Just to introduce it, it has an auditorium, which is a 400-seat auditorium, very much inspired by the original thrust space of the second incarnation of the Everyman from 1977 onwards. So a wraparound auditorium, very much a collective space. It does that perfect thing of combining the epic and the intimate that is the holy grail of auditorium design. It's a very, very special, vibrant space, somewhere that you really feel that things can happen. Alongside that, we have our social spaces. We have the bistro in the basement that again was part of Everyman history and lore. Everything else that's here is new. So we have a rehearsal room above this space. We have this Ev1, which is for our youth theatre, YEP, Young Everyman Playhouse, and for our work with community groups, education groups, and training for young technicians, young directors, young producers, young communicators. We have a rehearsal room above it. We have a recording studio. We have a wardrobe space. We have fantastic dressing rooms with natural light for the actors and everything, running water, all of these wonderful things. And we have a writer's room where writers can come and use it as a workspace. Any writer in the city can come and book in to use it. And we have entertainment spaces around the front of house. So it's very much been created with a view to making it possible for people to decide how they use it. So we're trying not to dictate how people use it, but to make it a place of possibility. For us, Robert's going to talk about the detail of the environmental sustainability strategies that we used and the decisions that we took along the way. But for us, environmental sustainability goes alongside financial sustainability. It sits amongst social sustainability and creative sustainability. So with financial sustainability, it's not just something that we have to focus on since the decision was taken that our public resources were not going to be used to the extent that they have been used for the public good. But that does exacerbate the issue that we do have to be much more financially astute and clever and careful. And the environmental sustainability strategies save costs. So in that sense, they were a no-brainer, but it's much more about the ethos of the Everyman, which has always been very forward-thinking, humane, kind, loving, a generous organisation that looks forward. And you can't do that without confronting the biggest issue of our age, which is the fact that if we don't change the way that we behave, then we won't be around to behave for too much longer. In terms of the creative sustainability, the writers' room is a way for writers to come in, use this building as a way of creating work for our stages, for other stages, for TV companies, for their own sanity. But it's making those creative things possible that then regenerate the arts in this building and around the city. The rehearsal room, likewise, the facilities that we have in the auditorium have been hugely, hugely inspiring to artists. People are absolutely beating down our doors, both within the city and nationally, because they find it such an inspiring space. So it's helping the art form to move forward. It's helping ideas to bubble up to the surface and then start to take shape in a way that they can be put in front of an audience. And in terms of social sustainability, the building has been designed to be very, very accessible for people with mobility difficulties. It's been designed to be sort of psychologically accessible in that the frontage is all open, it's glass, it's level access to the street, it's all very much on a human scale. So it should welcome people in and really act as that community hub where, again, it makes things possible. People can have whatever conversation they want here. They can start a political party over a pint in the basement that might revolutionise, might get rid of late capitalism, or might turn out to be some hideous fascist nightmare. But it's all about the possibility. It's about just sitting back and letting people use this space as their community hub. The other aspect of social sustainability is that we do an enormous amount of training with young people, including NEET young people not in education, employment or training, where particularly for our young technicians course and our base techs, which is sort of entry level for young technicians, which is specifically for NEET young people. A lot of the time these are very talented, potentially talented young people that simply haven't had the life chances that have enabled them to find out what they're good at. So we're creating those opportunities for them to develop an interest, develop a talent, and then go on to employment and training. The first cohort of young technicians that we had, there were 12 of them, 11 of them all went on to formal training or employment in lighting and sound technology. There was only one who decided he'd go off to America and become a football coach, but he might not have decided to do that if he hadn't been through the experience that we were able to offer. So it's about offering sustainability on all of those fronts, and environmental sustainability is very much at the heart of that, which Robert will be able to tell you more about.
Yes. Can we get the presentation? Oh, you'll need some visual stimulation to keep you going through this next bit. Soon we get that up.
Hey, you nicked my presentation.
Looks great.
Recycling, Steve, it's recycling. Okay, lovely. There it is, the new building in all its splendour, and there it is, the old building in all its splendour. So if anyone says, why did you pull down the old one, I hope those two photos give you one reason anyway. Alongside the artistic vision and the vision for accessibility for the building, sustainability has been at the heart of what we've been doing in the redevelopment. This was embedded very early on from when we were doing a development proposal when we first started working with some of the design team. It's described as a central element in the development, in the development proposal. The OJU tender instructions that went out shortly after we did this development proposal had a requirement for sustainable construction, for low carbon design, and for sustainable use throughout the life of the building. The commitment to sustainability was reaffirmed in the 2008 feasibility study, with our aim to improve on the minimum statutory requirements and to improve on best practice. At this stage, we were targeting a BREEAM rating of very good. And we started to look at how we could actually begin to achieve that aim. The new site footprint, which you can see there in yellow, overlaid on top of the old Everyman footprint outlined in red, couldn't accommodate everything that we wanted to do on the site. But acquisition of more land proved very expensive, and so we went for a much denser development and hopefully a much more efficient building at the end of it. The feasibility study concluded, unfortunately, that because of structural, economical, logistical reasons, that it wasn't going to be possible to retain any of the old structure. We set out priorities. Sorry, I'm going wrong there. There we go. We set out priorities for the project with an overarching green heading. You can see there, which is minimise running costs. And we use that very deliberately as a shorthand that everyone would understand, a shorthand for sustainability. We rounded it off, as you can see at the bottom, with another green bar, which says sustainability, the extra mile. The study at this point considered carbon balance, minimising embodied energy, insulation, thermal performance, air tightness, exploiting thermal mass, lots of different ideas in general terms. During stage C, the strategy for sustainability and environmental performance was developed further, and we started to look at trying to increase the BREEAM target to one of excellent. And against a backdrop of fast developing technology and even faster reducing availability of grants to implement that technology, we started looking at those technologies in detail. And we assessed them based on a balance of cost effectiveness, carbon savings, market image and technology risk. This balanced approach favoured things like solar thermal, photovoltaics, wind and CHP on a very similar basis. But looking at potential for carbon saving, only biomass and CHP really led the field. Biomass was rejected for a number of reasons, including poor availability of local supplies within a 25-kilometre radius of here, higher emissions from it, lower efficiency, and crucially, on our rather dense site, the need for storage space for the fuel. Wind power we also rejected because of problems with intermittent generation, but also because of noise and vibration, which in an auditorium which we're trying to make extremely quiet, better than concert hall standards, was always going to be a major technical challenge for us. So, as I say, we rejected that. We looked at air source heat pumps, and they were rejected at this point because the technology wasn't good enough, particularly in low winter temperatures. The high initial cost, as you can see there, of ground source heat pumps, coupled with the fact that we're sat here on a big sandstone ridge and goodness knows how far down you've got to go before you get to groundwater, that ruled out ground source technologies. The service engineers at the end of this stage of design process recommended that we should look further at small-scale CHP, combined heat and power, and at solar photovoltaics. And so that's really where we went. During stage C, we also did a lot of analysis using computer-based models, looking at just airflow and temperature for the natural ventilation systems that we wanted to put into the building. We found there was no real guidance for temperature levels in a naturally ventilated auditorium. The only thing we had got was what it told you about air conditioning, which we wanted to avoid. And that said you needed a maximum of 25 degrees. The models at this stage, however, showed us that at an outside temperature of 26 degrees, we were going to hit 28 degrees inside, or maybe even higher. So we thought at this stage maybe we're looking at a mixed mode auditorium, so we'll have some fans in there that will be needed in the winter to pump some warmth into the building, but also we run those at low speed in the summer to move air through faster and cool people down a little bit. During this stage and the next stage, we did extensive monitoring of the external and internal temperatures in the old Everyman auditorium. And that gave us the information that was really lacking in the guidance. So here you are, exclusive, free of charge to you today. We can tell you what you need to know. At 22 degrees centigrade, almost regardless of what the humidity is, the audience are happy. At 24 degrees centigrade, they start to comment a little bit about being warm. At 26 degrees centigrade, they complain. And at 29 degrees, they pass out. I should say, at stage D, the BREEAM target was now raised to excellent as well. Slightly pushed into it as well. We wanted to go that way, but in fact the funding requirements, which also were developing along with everything else, now required that we went that extra step. We continue to review low and zero carbon technologies and confirm the viability of the small CHP plant, which we now have, and the thermal load for that, so the heat that it generates, is matched to what we thought the basically the hot water requirement for the building was going to be. The side effect is we then generate 25 kilowatts or thereabouts of electricity. So we've got a very, very efficient system there, providing our base needs for both water and our base load for electricity. This was calculated to save 15.4% of our total site carbon emissions. We looked at solar thermal water heating, but found that only actually generated 3% savings, and because it would actually interfere with the CHP and make that less efficient and mean we would generate less electricity, we rejected that. Photovoltaics were found to in fact save even less carbon for us, and there was a bit of a problem finding enough unshaded area on the roof, because we've got this bit of a fly tower and a row of chimneys up there. At stage E, with improvements in the technology becoming available, the use of air source heat pumps was re-evaluated, and we've now found they were actually a viable method for heating the auditorium. The plus side on that is we can use them now in reverse cycle, so to cool the air coming into the auditorium in the summer, which allows us to take that peak temperature down and get us back to that magic 26 degrees before people start passing out. I should say the other big thing is the natural ventilation system relies on the huge thermal mass or stored warmth or coolth in the actual structure of the building and along the air path of the air coming into the building. And in fact what we found is that's performing much better even than we thought it was going to from the modelling. And in fact we've never had to run the cooling so far, in spite of the summer air temperatures this year of being well over 28 degrees. So magically does its own thing. By the end of stage E, we'd made most of the major environmental decisions. Many of the technologies and strategies employed can be seen here. And the review of sustainability actually continued through into construction. One of the very late things we did was to replace what had been planned as tungsten house lighting in the auditorium and put in LEDs instead. And this again was due to the actual technology maturing. The decision for adding that in, because it was quite a substantial additional cost, was made in exactly the same way as we'd made all the other decisions about sustainability and environmental aspects of the building. So it was done on a basis that it saves a lot of carbon. It also reduces our running costs quite substantially, and it also reduces our reliance on maintenance. The other thing I haven't mentioned at all so far about the building is the ecology. The old Everyman basically had no ecology apart from a few weeds growing out of the roof. And the ecological study, basically, you score a point on BREEAM for not making the situation worse. So in one of those things we've been talking about here, by not doing anything, we were actually ticking a box. That didn't seem to be quite good enough, though. So the new building does include some new things for ecology. We have bat boxes, we have swift nesting boxes up on by the chimneys, and we've just recently established our first beehive on the roof. So hopefully next year you'll be able to come back and get some honey from our catering facilities. And that's it.
If I could just round off, everything that Robert's talked about in the building is not the end of the story. I mean, we're very conscious that having created a green building where some of these strategies will just run on without us needing to do very much about them. But the main thing is how we behave and how our audiences behave and how we can then take that onto the next level. We built a theatre that's very, very accessible to people in wheelchairs, but then when it came to doing an event with Young Dada, where there were going to be 30 wheelchair users in the building, we found that actually you need one member of staff per wheelchair user if there's an evacuation. So we had to think very differently about how we worked, and a lot of staff across different departments trained in the evacuation procedures for that night. And the environmental strategy is exactly the same. We've got a building that can do all these things, but then we have to look at our behaviour and audience behaviour next.
Thank you both very much. It's worth saying that this building won a big award in July, an international award. I don't know if you say it's the WAN 2014 Performing Spaces Award, which is the best in performing arts venues anywhere in the world. And I think that says something about this holistic view of how all those parameters of sustainability, financial, social, environmental, and indeed creative and cultural are all part of a single approach to the space. And so thank you both very much. Very interesting just seeing the sort of grain that goes into it. This is going to be followed by the wonderful Steve Tompkins, who I've known for many years now, who's the sort of Tompkins half of Howard Tompkins Architects. Very obvious. But Steve is also a man who's got so many awards that it's quite ridiculous, actually, both already conferred but also happening. An architect of extraordinary talent, actually, and I'm really, really pleased that he's here today. He is the architect for this beautiful building, as well as some others which he's going to talk about. But I wanted to say, just before I bring Steve up, there was a tweet which called him, I know you don't want me to mention this, the Shakespeare of theatre architecture. But it is true, and the reason that Steve is here today is because he's changing the face of cultural spaces across this country and building into them some of these embodied values in a very practical, real way. As you can see here, you can see in the building I work in the Bush Theatre, and others he's going to talk about. So it's a fantastic partnership that Deborah and Robert and Steve have created out of this space. So that's Steve.
Be downhill from here after that intro. Thank you, Alison. Civility and transformation. I think these are the two outcomes which buildings for performance should try and achieve. I don't think you can have the latter without the former. And I think actually you could apply those two things to most debates. I think you could apply it to the debate around sustainability, around world politics, all the things that Pete was talking about. If you bang on about transformation before you actually engage with difference, before you can empathise, before you can listen properly, before you can understand that people are coming at it from different angles, they have different agendas, then you're not going to get anywhere. And I suppose the thing that my practice has been trying to do over the last 20 years or so is to make the spaces where that civility can happen and therefore be part of a wider transformation. I'm not interested in what we call shock and awe architecture. Anything with the word iconic in it makes me want to gag. I think we're so past that architecture of vanity, architecture of personal ambition, architecture of competition for some unspecified spoils. Because actually when I was listening to radio yesterday morning, I think it was, blah, 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 2-minute slot, we've lost 52% of our wildlife species in the last 40 years, 30-second slot, and then on to somebody defecting to UKIP from the Conservative Party. You think, did I hear that right? Actually this is the world we're in. This is the medium in which we're all carrying out our careers, our personal circumstances, our family life. We're all swimming in this together, so something has got to change, and we're all in it. My little world is the world of architecture, and I think my profession both has the capacity to be an agent of change to an extraordinary degree, because we're responsible for the thing, construction, which uses up maybe 30% of our carbon use in the world, and we're also one of the professions who are doing the least about it. We're actually so complacent as a profession. It's business as usual. We build huge expensive buildings for dodgy regimes around the world. we snipe at each other, we don't get involved, we don't actually, in the end, get down to it. And in a small way, we're trying to change that. So here are a few case studies. I'll be really brief because actually the conversation is more important than me blaring on. But when we talk about iconic architecture for incredible theatres, the two don't go together. Here are three of the best theatres in the world. That's the Booth du Nord, that's where Peter Brook works. He's made some of the most extraordinary theatre work ever seen. Actually, that looks like a Peter Brook set, funnily enough. A chair with a coat on it on a bare floor. There you go. And this is this kind of equivalent architecture. You'd walk past it without noticing it. That is the iconic facade of one of the great theatres in the world. That's the interior of another fantastic theatre, the Cartoucherie, again in Paris, run by Ariane Mnouchkine, who's been making world-beating architecture for 40 years in this space, precisely because you can muck it around, you can kick a pot of paint over it, you can nail things into the wall, nothing gets ruined, nothing gets scratched, nothing gets spoiled. The architect doesn't come back and complain because she's moved it around, etc., etc. It's permissive and it's adaptable, and there it is. It's part of the ambient life of this creative world. My favourite theatre in the world, the Teatro Officina in Sao Paulo. Again, you know, this is not something that municipal governments would want architects to design to put their city on the map in the kind of arms race of cultural architecture that we tend to get involved with. That's the interior. It's made of scaffolding. You can move it around. It's got a tree coming through the wall. The roof slides off. It's got a fireplace that you can light. It's bonkers proportions, and it's the most exciting space you've ever seen. It's just incredible. And because it kind of monkeys around with our expectations in it, it just allows us to come in and go, oh my God, I didn't think a theatre could be like that. That's what makes it fantastic. So here's the strategy. One strategy for us is remembering not to build for posterity. That's not the point. These are two opportunistic squats, really, in buildings which have been taken by developers. These are both for the Almeida Theatre in London. They lasted a year. They had no public subsidy. They relied on box office. They sold out every performance, and then they were knocked down and carried on. This was an old factory, which is resisting the slide controller. There you go. Oops. Great big old space. We borrowed scaffolding and seats. We didn't bother to mend the roof. We just put buckets in it. We knocked a floor out. That was where most of the budget went. It was quite expensive because it's a 900-seat theatre with all the trimmings. So they spent almost £1 million over 3 months to do this. And it looked like that. They ran 2 performances, Richard II, Coriolanus, and it was an absolute blast. And that sense of transgression, that sense of trespass into this space was what made it so exciting, what energised the audiences. They got in there with their hearts beating fast, so they felt like they were in something together. And immediately the drama was able to take off. The opposite of something which has signs and safety barriers and all that paraphernalia that you kind of lose the will to live before you even get into your seat. That's the set. I don't know if you can get... is there any blackout? Is there any lights off? I don't care. I'd much rather you see the images than my profile. Anyway, you can't miss my profile. So here's another version. The Almeida again, in King's Cross. When King's Cross was the sort of red light drug dealing district, it's now a posh developer apartments, and this was about to become that. And again, we took this bus garage and we turned it into a 500-seater and a 300-seater. Similar budget, similar timescale, 3 months from phone call to first night. Scaffolding, bonkers proportion, light, bright plastic. We borrowed turf to cover the roof because it was making too much noise from the rain and it was too cold. So we went to a landscape contractor, borrowed the turf for a year and then gave it back afterwards. And it was great because it was built by the people that make the sets. It's the same language. Nothing is precious. Everything feels provisional and exciting. And it kind of remapped the area of the city. Even though it was only there for a year, the memory of that space changed people's perception of the city. And I think there is something going back to sort of cultural sustainability and that sense of collective transformation of our cities. It doesn't have to be permanent architecture. It doesn't have to be expensive architecture. It's about human agency rather than architecture as such. This is a building which many of us know and love. This is the Bush Theatre in London. And the reason I show this image is because it's a project we got involved in. It's an old public library. We helped find the building for the client. We worked with them to work out how on earth we could pay for it. We were there right at the start of the process. We weren't engaged by project managers when all the decisions had been made. We were there as far upstream as it's possible to get. When this project was a twinkle in the eye, there was no site, no building. And there's also no budget. So we did it very, very cheaply. We handmade it. We made a lot of the furniture and fittings in our own studio. We got artist friends to paint the building for next to nothing. And it was, again, such fun, simply because it didn't feel like a posh, lottery-funded, expensive theatre space. It felt like something that, you know, like the best party, the best squat you could get. And it gradually accumulated over years. We asked the public in to come and draw on the walls what they thought they'd like to see. We've shifted the seats around in different configurations halfway through the building project, and people told us how they would like us to finish the building. This process is still ongoing, and I hope it never ends. The fact that these spaces are in a constant state of slow motion, evolution and change feels to me incredibly healthy and incredibly optimistic. And that's the space with the performance in it. Similarly, Battersea Arts Centre, a much bigger scale, but a similar kind of project. This is the kind of incubator of so much fantastic work coming out of the UK and has been for many years. We've been involved for nearly 10 years in this project, just working with artists, working with the public, working with the people that run the building. In a conversation, we've been helping artists make work, we've been helping to build sets, plot small changes that accumulate after each production, until we got to the point after 6 years where we knew exactly what it was that the building needed and exactly how much we needed to spend. And again, that's the opposite of somebody going, how much do you think we can raise? Okay, let's say it's £10 million, and now we'll interview architects and we'll have a beauty parade, and everybody will give us their wildest idea, and then we'll decide after we've appointed them that we don't like them much anyway and the idea was a bit shit. You know, that's the way a lot of buildings still get built in this country, and it's kind of iniquitous. If there is time to do it and there's an evolutionary process you can get involved in, then we've found this has been so healthy, and it builds the relationships which allow you to just work in shorthand. There's a trust, a telepathy, mutual good humour and respect, which works so well. And this is one of the performances that we helped to make to test the brief, in fact. And the whole of that building is now a performance space rather than just single auditoria dotted around the place. I won't dwell too much on that. But it's been great fun, and it's about to start on site with a big grant. Those are the sort of spaces that we've been quarrying back out. That was a black box auditorium when we found it. And that's the bar which we've been mucking around with. That's a pompous staircase which we decided to put a sort of folded stair carpet on to make chairs and tables, and kids love it, and it's constantly being played on and enjoyed. And it's just these little moves which are part of the fun. And we've been making these little acupuncture needles of signage popping into the building. The other thing is the sensitivity to place. I'm a great believer that if you spend enough time with a place, it will start to tell you what it wants rather than submit to your architectural will and ego. This is Snape Maltings out in Suffolk. I don't know if any of you know it. It's a place that musicians and artists have been drawn to since Benjamin Britten set up his HQ there. It's extraordinary. It's got that melancholy, beautiful, salty emptiness that you just want to sit and make art in, you know? And our job really, we were asked to put a new concert hall and some workspaces into it. And the job was for us to be almost invisible, for our footprints to be virtually indiscernible on the building, because there's so much texture, there's so much patina, there's so much poetry already inherent in that building. We just inserted one new space, and we took as our cue, that's the new space there, we took as our cue the texture of the buildings around it. So that's the new room, just with rusty metal roof and builder's plywood. It's very simple, and some concrete at the bottom, and daylight. And we used old lath, plaster lath for the ceilings. That's the finished foyer, so there was an effort to make it almost feel empty and derelict. You go into it, that sense of you're still having that unmediated encounter with these beautiful spaces, with the light and the air and the texture of history. I'm having an encounter with the slide controller right now. There we go. Oh, sorry. Yeah. And that was just a little insertion of a little ruined dovecot, which the planners asked us to put back as a Victorian dovecot. And we said, well, okay. And that's how it ended up. We sort of made a cast of it and loaded it into the shell, and it's just a little sculptural, inhabited sculpture. It's the smallest auditorium we've ever made, and it holds an audience of 5. Come on, there you go. And it's got this view out over the marshes. So it's just that attempt to capture the poetry of place. And this is the other version of that, an urban version at the Young Vic, where we learnt lessons rather from the temporary spaces we've made. This was a temporary theatre in 1917, and it was still there in 2001 when we started working on it. And again, we selectively demolished and rebuilt, used the texture and history of the place, a bricolage of very cheap, almost found materials and textures, where we could just make these architectural statements, broken up the scale, broken up the texture. It's the opposite of the culture palace. It's the opposite of the monolith. It wants to insinuate itself back into the texture and life of the street and be completely unintimidating, completely welcoming, completely straightforward, a mediator between people's ordinary lives and the work on stage. And we hand-painted the auditorium with yellow paint and lit it at night so that it does lovely things theatrically. That's some brickwork which we invented, mirrored ceilings, the sort of theatrical tropes, I guess, but which are ways of just welcoming people in, feeling like they're not in a white painted stainless steel chrome glass thing, which could be an insurance office, but you're expected to somehow feel stimulated and want to go to the theatre and have some kind of lovely evening and some sort of relationship. So we're learning lessons really from the street, from the demotic, from ordinary life. And there's a very conscious attempt for this building to be as transparent and porous to that everyday life as it can be, and become part of the life and noise and buzz of the street. And there's the auditorium, which is one of the models for the auditorium at the Everyman, in fact. Here's another one at Bath, where there was nothing apart from a stone shell to work with, so we just scooped everything out. It's a children's theatre, and we worked with the children for about 6 months before we put pen to paper. They told us the brief, we visited buildings together, and we put this kind of little mini glam horseshoe auditorium made of plastic sheet and felt and leather, and that opens up to the street. And it's good fun. And lastly, a small building which we made as a temporary space for the National Theatre. We're doing a sort of 10-year project to try and reimagine the whole of the National Theatre, which there's no time to talk about because it's endless. But as part of that was a temporary replacement for the Cottesloe Theatre called The Shed. It was called The Shed, it's now called something else. But I just show it because in terms of value, actual value for money, art per pound, fun per kilogram of carbon, you know, we need to invent these units, actually, just as an aside, because a lot of buildings are incredibly green because nothing happens in them. Nobody ever goes there, and nothing ever happens, and therefore they don't use any power, and they're held up as exemplars of good practice. This is mad. So we need another unit, but this I think is a good example of something which was punching above its weight. It didn't go through a 5-year Arts Council funded process and lots of gateways and quality control. It was sort of decided on the back of a fag packet over a weekend, and it was built by a local builder very quickly with plywood, with reclaimed steel, all designed to be demountable, but it kind of leavens that concrete tundra of the South Bank. It does something interesting, and it sets up this reciprocal relationship with the National Theatre, which kind of honours and amplifies both. And there it sits. And it's just, you know, partly it's just like being down the pub with your friends. There's no reason why culture spaces shouldn't just feel friendly and approachable and obvious. And that's the nature of the space, sitting there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Steve. I mean, I love the Shed because it's on probably perhaps one of the most prime pieces of cultural real estate in the country, maybe in Europe, and there it is, a big red box with with chimneys sticking out, and it's now, I know that it is often, a lot of people are talking about it as being a permanent, it's a permanent space that's taken over the page. It's fantastic. And our last speaker is John Holden, who knows a lot about culture and policy, worked across the cultural spectrum. He's done huge amounts of work on the notion of culture and on the notion of value. He's one of our most important cultural theorists, and has worked very intimately with an awful lot of arts organisations, written some beautiful stuff. I'd recommend going and reading something called All Together, which is about the Royal Shakespeare Company, and really pulls in the sort of bigger story about cultural value and sustainability and who we are as individuals. So thank you, John.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Because this dropped off several times while I was fiddling around with it. Yeah. All right. Very good. Okay. Well, Ali gave me the brief to sit and listen to what everybody was talking about, and then to synthesize notions of economics, politics, building, environmentalism, philosophical concepts of value into a neat 10-minute thing at the end. So no problem, eh? Let's begin where Ali began, with this idea about advanced capitalism being the only game in town. It reminded me of hearing once the Slovenian philosopher Žižek talking about cultural responses to late capitalism, and saying, I thought rather neatly, that there were two films that encapsulated the different options that you had. The first one was Brassed Off, so you can wallow in nostalgia. The second one is The Full Monty, so you take your clothes off and you join in. And he was saying that, you know, those are really the only two games in town left. Late capitalism has taken over. What do we do? Is there, to use, I'm from Demos, a third way that we could think about that might present some kind of opposition to this hegemonic concept? Well, one place clearly is the environmental movement. It was really interesting. I don't know, did anybody hear the Today programme report on the Green Party conference this year? The way it was reported, it was fascinating. They said the Green Party was proposing three things. One was the nationalisation of the railways. The second one was that the National Health Service should stay as a public entity and not be privatised. And the third one was that taxes should be raised. Now, when I was growing up in the 1970s, that was the central ground of politics. That was consensus politics. Everybody agreed that was a sensible way to run a society. This was called, by the BBC, this was called the extreme left. So you can see how we have moved in our everyday thinking to accepting all this crap that we've got from Thatcherism and Reaganism as just the way that things are. But there are places where it is being challenged. One of them is in the environmental movement. Now, Peter was right to say that the environmental movement is very bad at prediction. Very, very bad. I too have shelves full of books that predicted overpopulation by now. Peak oils was supposed to happen sometime around 1981. There've been resources were supposed to disappear, and they haven't done. But what the environmental is very good at, I think, is innovation. And if you look back again to the 70s, all those things that were thought of as completely wild at the time, like having creches, or maternity leave, or yogurt, or yoga, all of these things, and you know, the great Centre for Alternative Technology in McKinley, those people were looked at as real weirdos, but they invented solar power and wind power and hydroelectricity and all these kinds of things, and they've gone into the mainstream. So the green movement has an enormous amount to offer in terms of innovation. And the great thing, and the great reason for hope now in our time, I think, is the way that environmentalism and the green movement have moved together with the cultural sector to march together to bring innovation and creativity into the same breath. And you can see that exemplified in Julie's Bicycle itself. You know, the music industry setting up or supporting an environmental charity. You can see it in this building. You can see it in the Almeida. Just as an aside, I was very taken with your idea that having no money and no time is a great way to do things. I really think this is true. One of the other things I do is I'm a partner in a company called 3 Johns and Sheila Limited. And what we do is we intervene. We intervene in things. One of my colleagues, one of the other Johns called John Kiefer, intervened last week in Brussels when he saved a child from falling down some stairs and broke his foot in the process, which is why I'm here and not him talking at this very moment. But our first intervention was when the recession came along, we wanted to get a response from the cultural sector. So we went out and asked 50 of our friends to write essays about how the cultural sector should respond to the recession. We got in 50 things, some of them plays, some of them poems, some of them essays, some of them photographs. We put together a publication and got a designer to do it and a cartoonist, and we did it in 28 days from talking in a bar to having it in our hands. No money changed hands. There was no time at all to do it, and it won 3 design awards. I'm very, very proud of it. So no time, no money is a great way of going about things. Anyway, back to neoliberalism. What is neoliberalism doing? In a nutshell, it's destroying the public realm. The very essence of it is to privatise. That's what it is all about. So places like parks and streets and shopping places that used to belong to the public now belong to the private sector. The cultural sector is one of the very few places left where we have public spaces where we can congregate and challenge. Second thing is, it is destroying the environment. Business might be very good at innovating to reduce carbon and all the rest of it, but taken in aggregate, nothing has changed. Things have got worse. Ali has tons of statistics on this, don't you, about how things are just getting worse, in spite of all the innovations that business comes up with. And the third thing, I think, is that it really only values the individual. It places the individual at the heart of its philosophy. It's about individual pleasure, the maximization of individual gain. Culture, by contrast, is inherently communal. The great cultural economist, David Throsby from Australia, says that culture is a communal endeavour. Michael Boyd, the former artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, said that the conditions of creativity are also the conditions for community. Culture, community, creativity go hand in hand. And that in itself is a challenge to the neoliberal way of thinking. So this is a good thing. So one way in which we can start to reassert a different kind of value is by bringing the creative, the communal, and concern for the environment together in one place. Now, I've just used for the first time the word value. The word value is a very, very, very difficult word on which great people have written lots and lots of stuff. So we haven't got long to talk about it, but there is in the air at the moment a lot of discussion about cultural value, about public value. It seems to be part of the discourse in the cultural world and in the political world. Indeed, I was quite amused as I was coming up on the train. I took this pencil out of my pencil case and I twisted it in my fingers, and it says on it, the Australian Academy of the Humanities, creating value. So value is everywhere, even on my pencil. But we need to kind of pick it apart because it's a tricky word. Value in the singular suggests some kind of utility and hence some kind of measurement. Values in the plural suggests ethical considerations. And it's quite difficult to put these two things together, which is one of the reasons, I think, why politics struggles so much with culture. It doesn't know whether to view it as an ethical good in its own right or as something that ought to benefit us in some kind of way, and that way we should be able to measure. So it gets very confused about what the essence of culture might be. There's also the notion within value that you can have two distinct kinds of value. One is a value in exchange, so that I can sell you my pullover or my pencil, and another is a value in use. I love my pullover, and I don't care how much money you're prepared to pay for it. I don't want to exchange it. It means something deep to me, this pullover. These two things are again, radically different things. And neoliberalism is really only interested in the value in exchange, not the value in use. Something is only worth something if you can sell it, if you can flog it on in the market. So, where was I? Yeah. So, values. We've got all this confusion around values, but the thing we know about the ethical side of values is that they are a human construct. They are contingent, they vary from time to time. We decide as a society what those values will be. They are subjective, even if they are shared. And we also know that we can get into terrible trouble by talking about universal values. We can get in even deeper trouble if we start talking about British values or anything really dangerous and tricky like that. So values are this construct that we have in our heads, but they are grounded as well when we come into the notion of a building. Because a building, in contrast to all that airy-fairiness, is very solid. It's bricks and mortar and stone and pipes and all the rest of it. We hope it's enduring. We hope the roof doesn't fall in. So what's the relationship between these two, the building and the values? Well, clearly, buildings can and do embody values. Buildings say things to us. Sometimes this is really explicit. If you look at the House of Commons, as you probably all know, there was a competition about the design of the House of Commons after it burnt down in, I think it was the 1830s, was it? 1820s, 1830s. And there were two main designs came up. One was a classical design and one was a Gothic design. And it was decided that, the classical was all about predictability, about ancient Greece, about all those noble virtues. The Gothic embodied Christian virtues, and they chose the Gothic as a very, very self-conscious way of stating to the world, this is a Christian country, we are Christian people, these are the values that our House of Commons embodies. Or there's the Walker Art Gallery with all those steps and that great big thing that's meant to intimidate you and tell you that you have a very low place in the hierarchy and all that kind of stuff. So buildings really, really talk to us and tell us something. Sometimes those values are very hidden, sometimes they're very explicit. What I like about all these theatre buildings is that I think they walk that tightrope between being explicit and implicit very, very well indeed. You can tell there's something different, but quite often you can't put your finger on it. You know it's different, you know you like it, and it's telling you the whole aesthetic of it is telling you something. And it's lovely to hear all about the detail of just how great it is in the way that it functions, both for people as well as for the environment. So buildings are really, really very important, I think. But my question, maybe we could move into questions. I'm going to kind of share the questions and the discussion from now on. But maybe I could bring everybody back and start off with a question of my own to you, if that's all right. And the question is this. Buildings can clearly embody values, but can they promote values-based behaviour? Can this building make the citizens of Liverpool into more environmentally conscious citizens who actually do things differently, do you think? Or is that asking too much of a building? Discuss.
Can the building do it, or can the way that we talk about the building do it? Certainly promoting the fact that there are environmental interventions here makes people feel good about it, makes people feel good about themselves and the city, and and I suppose the next step is to see if that then prompts discussion. Does it prompt changes in behaviour? The biggest aspect of our carbon footprint is audiences driving here. That's actually, and that's not the building, but can the fact that this is a green building and that makes people feel good prompt people to think about perhaps car sharing, getting the bus, maybe.
I think maybe the role of the space is to embody and amplify the values of an organisation which is inhabiting it. And I think, as Deborah was saying, it's actually the agency is with the organisation, with the programme of work that's happening in there. if the building can midwife those processes, then it's a good building for that purpose. And I think that's why spaces, you know, I'm deeply suspicious of architects that have a set formula. I mean, maybe we do, but I'd like to think we try and character act our way into organisations and adopt the behaviour and the values in order to try and align the architecture with an organisation. So I think if that's working and the building is a good ambassador for the values of and the programme of the organisation, then yes, it can. If it's simply, you know, a doodle from the genius mind of the lone architect in his garret, then probably not.
Okay. We won't name names, will we?
I think they can normalise new forms of behaviour. I think it's very difficult to preach to people that they should do something in environmentally friendly way if the environmentally friendly option is easier. You know, it's ridiculous telling people not to get on a plane when you charge 30 quid for them, and you look for a train and it costs you 300 quid, and you can book the plane a year in advance and you can't book the train a year in advance. So, you know, you can make it a normal thing. I think secondly, you can show that this kind of thing is possible. You can inspire people. I think it's pretty scary when I do something like I walk up Park Road and I see the big new Tesco's that was thrown up, which to me looks like a really shabby building with no care whatsoever, with a huge car park underneath, that's killing, you know, what was left of local shopping in that area. There wasn't much before it, and put, you know, the final nail in it. So I think you can absolutely inspire people. You spoke a lot about working in temporary buildings, and I love that idea that you create spaces which are DIY, bottom up. You provide space for people to do things themselves, but also some of the buildings I thought you're designing, they're still going to be here in 100 years. I mean, I live in a house in Egbert which was built in 1898. It's probably got another 100 years in it. So some of the buildings would have thought you need to be thinking 200 years ahead.
This one certainly would be designed, you know, you'd hope this building would be here in 150 years,
Yeah.
but not necessarily in the
This
form
form.
that we left it.
Yeah.
You know, if it has the inbuilt capacity to adapt and change, you know, it was the Hope Hall, then it was the 1970s incarnation, now it's this one. It's almost like you're stepping onto a very slowly moving conveyor belt of transformation, and the timescale of architecture is tangible. And again, I think one of the mistakes that we made as architects and as modernists was a sort of denial of the passage of time, both in terms of trying to make year zero architecture, which was the final word, but also saying these buildings will never stain, they'll never need to be painted, they will always be white, they'll always be pristine, you know, nothing terrible and insanitary will ever happen to them, where of course life isn't like that. So if you can make buildings which say this is life, this is life in all its viscera, all its complexity, and all its joyfulness, and try and make an architecture which somehow represents that, then you're probably onto a better trajectory as far as I can see.
I thought it's difficult to get a building though. I mean, I'm thinking of you designing all the green things you want for, like, this building's got ventilation, and then actually you find on a cold day everybody brings in a heater, because that doesn't work. So the everyday practices go against what you thought the building would do. I would have thought that must be devilishly difficult to think through how everyday people were going to use it.
We had a very interesting debate at the BAE, which Ali was involved in, where we would try to persuade people to read a weather forecast for the building before they came, because we didn't want to heat or cool the building in any form. So we said, if you come tonight, it'll be 29 degrees, so bring a t-shirt and shorts. If you come that night, it'll be 14 degrees, so bring a coat and a blanket, which is kind of obvious and joyful behaviour in some ways, isn't it? But we've built ourselves into these expectations of perfectible spaces, which just require more and more money and more resources, more and more energy to make sure that nothing unpredictable ever happens to us once we're in here. We have a frictionless experience, which is kind of the opposite of going to the theatre.
Can I also say, John, and I'm really interested in what was moving, but I think the question is so obviously yes. The question really, I think, perhaps is how do public spaces, how are we public spaces? I mean, how we live, where we live, what we surround ourselves with, what we wear, You know, they're all indications of who we are as individual, as human beings. And I think this is a really, really important question. So you go outside, and there's I don't know if any of you've noticed, there's a line of cement. And what it's done is it looks like wood, and it's beautiful. It's even got the sort of woodworm holes in it. Do you know what I'm talking about? On the walls. It's saying something incredibly profound, that actually our relationship to the natural world and our capacity to design ourselves around it and align ourselves with a different way of celebrating the world is, I think, incredibly profound. I think it's much more profound, actually, than perhaps we think it is. So you go into the House of Commons and you get, oh, okay, that's who I am. You become part of it. You go into a space like this and you recognise there's something very deliberate about celebrating the grain of that plywood over there. And it's incredibly important, I think. It's incredibly important that we do that. We look at ourselves differently.
Let's have a discussion. Who'd like to talk? Yeah. Oh, no, it'd be a good idea if you say who you are and everything. Yeah.
Andy Stratford from Walker Plank in Manchester. I'm interested in the environmental ecology of alternative cultural spaces. So spaces which Stephen was talking about, which are pop-up theatres or non-traditional architecture, non-traditional buildings. And I think, does anyone know of any work that's been done? I mean, you talked about one of the biggest issues with people coming to attend a theatre in terms of carbon footprint is everybody driving to the theatre. So take the theatre to people in a different place. We used to run a touring theatre ship, which we took around the country. So it's a pop-up theatre before the word pop-up was invented. But has anyone done any work on the ecology of that and about how carbon-friendly moving theatre about is, rather than just having it in buildings?
Yeah. We've done various bits and pieces looking at the difference between audiences coming to you and you coming to audiences. And there's stats to say, you know, there's stats to show that if you, we've done it particularly around festivals actually, if you go to a festival, what's your carbon footprint? And it's a very interesting conversation. But I think that it's deeper than just the stats. So one of the things that we're looking at is what's beyond the statistics that say your carbon footprint is higher if you do one thing over another. And I think the whole pop-up movement, for want of the shorthand, is a really interesting example of how we're rethinking what do we expect out of place. And very at the moment, actually, perhaps you presaged a piece of work that's being done by Payne's Plough, who've just produced a touring theatre in the round that is literally a pop-up theatre. They dismantle it and they're just touring it around the country. And I think that's, you know, it's what's happening to so many of the ways that we're thinking of ourselves in relation to space. So it's all become wildly open, and I think it's really going to change touring models really quite profoundly. Yeah. Does anybody want to add to that?
We've been doing a little bit of work. I've just come back from Jordan, where I've been talking to artists in the Arab region about the possibility of a moving space which can go to different locations in the Arab world. And so we've been looking at the logistics of, you know, actually how much resources it take to dismantle a building, say like the shed. You know, could you make it out of much lighter materials? What are the manual skills, the manual labour available, etc., etc. It very quickly becomes an incredibly wide-ranging and complex problem. If you combine it to just something like kilowatts or kilograms of carbon, it's too reductive. It immediately becomes a socio-political and economic problem as well as a resource-based problem. But just one thing about the pop-up, I always think that a pop-up space is like the first sentences of a conversation with a friend, whereas a permanent building is like a script that you begin to read together. You know, neither is better or worse, and neither is inherently going to end at any particular point. It's just you don't quite know which direction it's going to take off in and where it might take you. So, you know, the Young Vic's a really good example of a 5-year pop-up built in 1970, which has now become, you know, one of the great theatres in the world. And so I think there's an issue about setting off with confidence and with joy and trust, and actually trusting your common humanity to take you somewhere rather than trying to preempt that. So I think both ways of working, I feel, are just different sorts of permanent. And yeah, sorry.
The pop-up theatre thing. I can recall in the late 60s, early 70s, Century Theatre being toured round in Arctics, certainly around the Lake District, because I was living, and the north. So you know, there is history about that.
Very much so.
Yeah. Not terribly green, I suspect, those Arctics, but who knows.
There were Victorian portable theatres which would arrive by horse and cart, and they weren't tents, they were proper hard buildings. They'd be put up in about 3 days, and they had something like 3,000 capacity, and they would just come in, horse-drawn vehicles, put up in 3 days, taken down, move on to the next town. So there's a lot of historic precedent for those spaces.
Hang on a second, wait for the mic.
Hello, good. It felt like your question was relating to the problem being that it's people travelling to the theatre, but I don't understand that if you're still if you're touring a pop-up theatre, wherever you decide to pop it, it's people still going to travel to it. Even if you take it to a local town, to the town centre or something, people still are going to get there, unless you're going to kind of flash mob a show. But if you're going to, I might be getting confused, but if you're going to, say if you took a pop-up production of Shakespeare or something, people are still going to have to know where it is and then go to it.
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
One of my board members is a guy called Melvin Ben, who's Managing Director of Festival Republic, responsible for festivals as big as Reading, Leeds, Latitude. And his response, and others, his response to this is the Greenest Festival is a festival that we don't put on. So that's the end of that's the beginning and the end of the big dilemma. And it is absurd. It's absurd, you know. That one of the things that because we've been doing, we've done a fair bit of the sort of the instrumental measurement, particularly around, as I say, the big festivals, who've got themselves into real pickles around audience travel. It is very difficult, and you know, for many cultural and arts organisations like Glyndebourne or like all the big festivals or the Royal Shakespeare Company, audience travel is very often the highest footprint by a long way. What we don't do, though, is say, well, in that case, it's bad. You know, what you've got is what I think Steve is saying and what you've been saying is that actually there are many, many models around this, and they're all part of an ongoing experience. And it's not about, you know, if you've got to travel somewhere, it's a problem. It's about being very creative, and there are some very creative solutions to travel that particularly have been pioneered by greenfield site festivals. To do with audience incentives, and we've got massive case studies of that. Really, I think, though, that also this conversation is a bigger one, which is around how can we create a very diverse, creative, imaginative, kaleidoscope of different ways of experiencing art. And it has got very stuck over the last 10 years. I mean, you said the history. Actually, troubadours, you know, the idea of travelling artistic experiences as old as people, you know, we just have got stuck in this place that is about the spectacular, and this is just a rarefied part of it. But in many instances, art is still seen through the prism of the spectacular, the big shows, the big productions, and I think that's really what we're questioning now. That this is about a bigger canvas that we can do something quite exciting with. Does that help? Yeah. Good.
Is this on? Yeah, I think it just should be.
Hi, thank you. Okay. I feel like an odd one out here. I'm a civilian in this. felt happiest in and cheered at the end was Steve Tompkins Theatre. It's quite amazing. My wife and I went to the Shed to see Hotel during the summer. And we, bloody great, it was a bit of a mess of a performance. There was too much business. It was a film rather than theatre. But it was fantastic, it was great. It was young people, not all who were brilliant actors, just having a bloody good go at something deeply political. And I'm an old fella, and I want to carry on having a deeply good go at something deeply political. And, you know, power to this building, because I hate Liverpool, I have to say. I live here. I hate Peel Holdings, I hate the Duke of Westminster, I hate the fact that my city is being privatised and built on. I'm de facto now, I'm not a yuppie, I'm a, what's the old house equivalent, you know, a boy from Page Moss who's made it. But I'm deeply resentful that my city is still one of the poorest cities in the country. And if you go over the water to Birkenhead, that's even worse. It's been hollowed out by late capitalism, which is anti-democratic and anti-nationalist. These people owe their allegiance to their class. And when I come here, every time I come here, I realise my allegiance is to my class and it's to my culture, because it's not their culture. And this is reinforcing everything that's wonderful in the world. Thank you, thank you.
Haven't already booked. It's that.
From the cultural area, but I'm a child of the punk generation, and for me the great thing about punk was do it yourself. And from what I've heard, in the way cultural production is going, we're moving away from the world of the Beatles, where there's a few people putting on the spectaculars, selling loads and loads and loads and loads of records, because everybody downloads it now for free. And where the livelihoods are being created is now in a far more democratic way. It's far more local, it's far more back to garage bands, people doing it for themselves. So is the solution less finding a way to take a spectacular to people in a low carbon way? It's more creating places like the Flory that's opening up, where they're more local, where you can create places for people to do what they want to do, and they can get to them a lot more easily. And also for the cultural sector to know when it's not their battle, in a way. If people come to this place because the council sees fit to build more car parking and lower the prices and Arriva charge a lot to get on the bus, then that's a battle that needs to be done, for better public transport and for less car culture in the city. But that's not something that the cultural sector can win on its own. So I wouldn't beat yourself up if people drive here because the stupid council makes car parking cheaper. It's part of it is get involved with those that want to see a green, egalitarian, sustainable Liverpool, where public transport is much better and a lot cheaper. And then you wouldn't dream of getting in a car because you get on a bus because it's more fun.
I do want to say that we don't want to say to anybody, don't come. And actually, I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet about car sharing. I used to hitch all the time, and I still think that its time needs to come again. But the idea of, if we can persuade people coming to the theatre to give each other a lift, then that's environmentally sustainable. It's a better deal financially for them, and it's quite a socialist thing, I think. It just has that sort of additional aspect, and then of course they can chat about the show, so it sort of reinforces the cultural experience that they've all had, and they share it with perhaps people that they wouldn't otherwise have had a conversation with. So again, back to those sort of 4 pillars, just that little idea might tip something in quite an interesting way, prompted by thoughts of environmental issues.
Just very quickly like to add to what you said about changing from sort of individuals doing something incredible to do-it-yourself sort of things going on. And I think just adding to that collaboration is key. And I think everybody here has mentioned it to some degree or referenced it. And I think not just in people who are doing well in their professions, but people who are starting out, I'm starting out my own company creatively, and it strikes me more and more how key collaboration is in areas where you never, I think with the technology world that we live in, how it's more key than it's ever been before, because everyone seems to be so cross-skilled. Like, it's not enough just to be really good at one thing. You know, experts in their field here that are sort of constantly looking to other people, other sources, other things. And I just thought that seems really key at this time now.
Interesting things have been going on in the cultural world in the last 15 years. I think that really, actually, revolutionary isn't too strong a word to use, because the tools of cultural production are in everybody's hands now. It's much easier to produce your own culture to a standard which can, means you can sell a ticket for it. You can collaborate much more easily. You can cooperate. You can find an audience and so forth. And it's having extraordinary effects. I mean, in the business world, it destroyed the model of selling CDs within 5 years. First iTunes was downloaded in 2001. Tower Records, the biggest retailer of music in America, went bust 5 years later. So it's incredibly disruptive, but it is wonderfully democratizing, and we should all really take advantage of it and encourage everyone else to take advantage of it too.
One I think the people in charge of the city don't always get it is, I don't know if any of you went to the International Festival for Business, and it was reproducing this idea of like the entrepreneur is a Richard Branson or a Michael Heseltine. It's a rich, powerful person that creates jobs for the rest of us, which has always been bollocks, but it's particularly bollocks at the moment. And it's not, spending more time on places like the Baltic creative area where you're providing spaces for people to do it themselves. I don't know if any of you have seen the Fallout Factory opposite the municipal buildings, which I think is fantastic. It was set up by a couple of JMU students, and they wanted to create a space for people to fall out of uni in a safe way. So, you don't have to go and get some job at a graduate level if that's not what you want to do, but you don't have to go home to your parents either. It's a place where you can spend some time creating your art and creating what you want to do. And we need far more of that. We've got stuff like Blackburn House, which is good at it, the Baltic Creative, but we haven't as yet in this city spent enough time nurturing the talent in this city that's going to create the economy of the future, and recognising that that's what we want, not trying to get Amazon to build a big box to give people crap jobs. And I think that the thing that's for me is inspiring is that I say that to people at the university, and whatever, lefty talking. But when people in the creative sector speak, or people in the Baltic speak, people go, oh, yeah, okay. If you say that, we'll listen to that. So you and I could say the same thing, and you'd get a hearing in a way I wouldn't. Because you're better than me, but also because that the stuff in the university is just devalued that way. So the people in the creative sector have got a huge power at the moment.
And a huge responsibility as well. I mean, that's the other thing that goes with it. And one of the things that we talked about ourselves with Deborah and Gemma and Robert is that the possibility of this space, being so much more than the theatre, being a place for discourse, for cooperation, for collaboration, for genuine meeting. I think somebody described it as a place where strangers could meet in peace, and it is that whole thing about the building as a benign host and as a provocateur and as somebody that is going to stimulate but also be as inclusive as possible. And for me, these sorts of buildings, they are points of societal resilience and continuity. These are the public places where, we work out what the hell we're going to do. People like Kevin meets people like you, and that stuff goes on, and that for me would be the dream come true if this becomes one of the places in Liverpool where you can go and you're going to meet somebody and get into a conversation, whether you see a show or not, frankly. But if this becomes one of those places where you think this is public space, this really is public space, we own this space, then that's the outcome.
I'll speak louder. We also we do talk about buildings embodying values, linking that. I don't know if everyone here has heard of it, but a place called Mellow Mellow in town, which that seems to, that has a whole community built around it, and it seems to represent people's values. And it recently got shut due to some stupid law about water or something that's never been brought up before, but now is suddenly relevant. And a whole place in the community has just been shut down. It's just thought, oh yeah, it's been shut down, and it feels like a death of people's values. Like people have been talking about it more than just, oh, they've shut a building down. They're like, our whole artistic hub has just been in one day gone boom by. So I think it could possibly definitely embody something.
Keywords, yeah, gentrification, and that's what can so often happen. That creatives work in a building like you create, that adds a lot of value that some other property developer later capitalises on, and things like Mellow Mellow is a perfect example of that. The people running the Fallout factory told me that the guy that owns it wants them out because he wants to put student residence in there. So they've stabilised this building and put some value into it. Bye bye. So the part of when I said about local authorities need to leave people alone, which I think they do, but they also need to protect them and create spaces. Yeah.
It's absolutely a double-edged sword. Yeah. I mean, when David Lann and I at the Young Vic we were deliberately trying to make a sort of resistant strain of architecture, which would actually resist the encroachment of commercial building coming across from the North Bank of London over Blackfriars Bridge. And architecturally, visually, it kind of tries to do that. But of course, I talked to the person who runs the laundry over the road and said, why are you shutting down? Well, because your building's made this street sufficiently cool that my rent's gone up and I can no longer afford it. So, we have to be aware about the limitations, I guess, of our powers. We can't be naive about it.
Just to sort of bring it slightly back and again, do sort of pitch in. One of the things I think that's very important around all of this, if we're looking at the full value proposition and bringing back into the frame this, what does that actually mean? What does a full value proposition mean, rather than just taking a slice or a few slices of that? I think the whole role of cultural value and indeed of the aesthetic is really critical in this, because what we're talking about is shifting norms. So there is that fraughtness about gentrification is a good thing. In many regards, it's a good thing, and it also has many areas of fallout. It's the theory of unintended consequences. So what we're actually talking about is how do we navigate, and somebody said that these paths, these spaces allow us these tightrope paths. How do we navigate to a point where we actually are pulling in the full value proposition without chopping bits off? And I think the arts, the cultural spaces are those open spaces. We've heard lots of words around adaptability, around openness, about transactions, around collaboration, but also around being very uncomfortable and going into uncomfortable spaces and really challenging norms. So how we do this, how we start to think, well, what does a full value proposition look like? What is a fulsome approach around cultural value, recognising its profound responsibility now? It has to be something about how it looks and feels. What is the experience? And that is, I think, where the arts come into their own. So does anybody want to ask anything else around any of that?
Hi, I'm thinking about some of the larger organisations in Liverpool, specifically the Biennial and the Everyman. The Biennial did an amazing project called Home Baked, which completely revolutionised around Anfield and was very active against a lot of the forced devaluing of the area by Liverpool Football Club, and also the Throwing Light on the Wreck project that the Everyman did. And it's about being responsive as well to the periphery of the city centre, which is something that I think is really important and needs to be in part responsible for these buildings to have these tendrils which go out and bring in. It has to be a continual cycle around and making sure that people don't feel that these spaces, which are wonderful and once you're inside you do feel very liberated by, don't become that kind of, oh, it's not for me, which I think is quite often pushed even by how culture and arts is portrayed in the media. It's seen very elitist, and it's the ability to kind of level it out, which I think is really important that we need to kind of work through.
Everyman on a regular basis? Sorry, I can't help it.
and as a sort of, what I've been hearing a lot today is the clarity of each of the speakers' intention of the building. At that moment that the power and the sort of velocity can build speed, and that's when you can inspire others as well. And it strikes me this building is absolutely intrinsic to its goals, its intentions are very clear, and that it embodies in its atmosphere and choice of materials everything that's been discussed today. And the thing that I get is this overwhelming sense of its intention to make a difference in the community, to inspire. This gentleman here, I mean, you can't ask, I don't think, for anything more profound than, you know, somebody who's been following the progress of this building and has come and to say, thank you, you know, this is some place that I can feel connected, feel possibilities, and, you know, it's a very emotional, and I think it's engaging the emotions as well as intention. Those two factors for me seem to be like a vehicle for change, and I think today, from my point of view, I've kind of got a very big injection of those two qualities, so I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
I'd like to say thank you to everybody for coming. And I'd like to say thank you very much to everyone for speaking. I think it's been really, really interesting discussion. Very, very rich indeed. I'll just leave you with one building I came across once where there was a new gallery and the architect complained loudly because the fire extinguishers hadn't been painted grey to match the rest of the building. So it can be done wrong as well. Okay, over to you, Ali.
Ditto for the thank you. Thank you for all the amazing speakers, and especially thank you to you all for coming. I hope it's been valuable in some way. I'm very jealous that you can all stay here. I'm leaving Liverpool. It's been a real pleasure. So much has come up actually around what we want what we feel around our art spaces in relation to ourselves as individuals, to communities and to the wider world. And I really hope that we can take some of this wonderful creative energy forward and commitment forward, because actually we've got everything to be inspired by, I think, right under our noses. And it's really exciting. Just to say that the arts are doing some really, really wonderful things at the moment, and I think we really can be very optimistic that actually the forces of change are actually here, right in front of us, and it's really just about how we muster them, collaborate together, come together, and take some sort of wonderful command of our future. So thank you to everybody, and just a few little notes. One is you've got some feedback forms under your chairs. We decided we didn't want you to sit on them, so we put them under the chairs. Please fill them in if you can. It's really helpful for us. Also, I'd like to thank especially the Everyman Theatre and indeed Arts Council England, who've made this whole series of work possible. And it's worth saying that the Arts Council are doing some extraordinary, groundbreaking things around environmental sustainability, coupling that with the arts. They're doing more than any other body of its kind anywhere in the world. So thank you to the Arts Council. We'll send you, now we've got you on the on the database, we'll send you details of upcoming events. We're doing something in Manchester in the new year, fairly similar at Manchester Art Gallery. But there's also all sorts of other things happening all over the place. We'll be blogging, and we'd love to hear your stories too. So if you want to tell us your stories that we can pull in as part of this big story of change, please do come and tell us. And there's now going to be some drinks. So where are they, Show? In the theatre bar. So do come and join us for them. And just as last, good luck to Deborah. It's the first night of Juno and the Paycock tonight. So you're going to running down the road. So good luck for that. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Thank you.